Ancient armies conquered continents not through brute force alone, but through a hidden backbone of supply and coordination. By the end, you will understand the ingenious systems that kept millions of soldiers fed, hydrated, and moving across impossible distances. Think of it as a moving city with its own supply chain, far more complex than a modern supermarket. How did a Roman legion carry enough grain for weeks? And what made the Mongol supply train faster than any before? What does it take to move an army farther than your eyes can see? A single Roman legion consumed roughly 15 tons of grain every day. That is the weight of about 3 fully grown elephants in just basic food, and that is before you count a single drop of water for their animals. A standard legion numbered around 5,000 men, and each soldier needed at least 3,000 calories daily to keep marching under full armor and equipment. Most of those calories came from wheat, ground into flour and baked into hard tack or boiled into porridge. 15 tons sounds like an enormous number, but it is only the beginning. Now add water. A man on the march in warm weather requires about a gallon of water per day just to stay hydrated, and more if he is carrying 50 pounds of gear under the Mediterranean sun. That means 5,000 gallons of water every single day for the men alone, but the animals are far thirstier. A single Roman cavalry horse needs 10 to 15 gallons daily. A mule carrying supplies needs at least 8. Multiply that by the hundreds of animals attached to a legion, and the daily water requirement for an army of 5,000 could reach as high as 30,000 gallons. Fresh, clean water that could be carried and distributed across miles of dusty roads. And do not forget the animals also need to eat. A horse consumes 10 to 20 pounds of grain and hay each day. That is another 2 or 3 tons of fodder added to the daily tally on top of the soldier's grain. Now consider how all of this gets moved. A typical army mule can carry about 200 pounds of supplies. So to carry just 1 day's worth of grain for the soldiers, an army needs at least 150 mules. To carry the grain for the animals themselves, you need hundreds more. And those mules also need to eat, so you are carrying food for the carriers. This is where the numbers spiral into something that feels almost impossible. The Roman army solved this problem by using a network of forts, rivers, and coastal supply depots. They built roads not just for soldiers to march on, but for wagons to roll along with predictable speed. A wagon pulled by oxen could carry 1,000 pounds, but oxen move slowly and eat constantly. A marching legion could consume a whole month's worth of supplies from a single depot in just a few days, forcing them to keep moving toward the next source of food and water. Now shift to the Mongol horde, and the numbers become almost unimaginable. A Mongol army on campaign often included 100,000 mounted warriors, each with 4 or 5 horses. That means 400,000 horses or more, all needing grass and water every single day. A single horse can drink 20 gallons when hot and tired. Multiply that by 400,000, and you are talking about 8 million gallons of water daily for the horses alone. That is more water than most modern cities consume in a day. The Mongols did not carry most of their supplies. Instead, they moved with their food on the hoof. Herds of sheep, goats, and yaks followed the army, providing meat and milk. They used mare's milk, fermented into a nutritious drink called arag, and they would tap a horse's blood in emergencies. This allowed them to travel light and fast, far faster than any Roman supply train. Yet even the Mongols had hard limits. Their armies could only move through regions with enough grass and water to support tens of thousands of animals. A drought, a dry season, or a single burned field could stop an entire invasion. Logistics was the real governor of every ancient campaign. It decided which cities could be besieged, which rivers could be crossed, and how long an army could stay in the field before it had to turn back or starve. When you look at these numbers, you begin to understand why ancient generals spent more time planning supply routes than they did planning battle formations. The greatest commanders were not just warriors, they were also the chief supply officers of their age, and the ones who understood the true weight of a loaf of bread were the ones who changed history. Before a single soldier stepped onto the march, a general had to become a detective, a geographer, and a farmer all at once. He could not afford to guess where the next river was or whether the local harvest would be enough to feed his army. The entire campaign depended on information gathered weeks or months in advance. Scouts fanned out ahead of the main force, moving quietly through hostile territory to map waterholes, measure the width of mountain passes, and note the condition of local grain stores. They questioned merchants, shepherds, and captives, piecing together a picture of the land that would either sustain or destroy the army. A Roman commander like Julius Caesar spent as much time writing down what he learned as he did drilling his troops. In his Gallic commentaries, he describes sending scouts to test the depth of rivers, to check whether bridges were intact, and to observe how much fodder was still standing in the fields. That fodder was not just a detail, it was a hard calculation. If the local hay had already been harvested or burned, the army's horses and mules would have nothing to eat within days. The same went for grain. A region that had just endured a poor harvest might not have enough spare wheat to support even a small passing force. Caesar would sometimes change his entire invasion route based on one scout's report about a dry creek bed. Perhaps the most famous example of pre-march intelligence comes from the Greek mercenary army led by Xenophon, whose story is recorded in the Anabasis. Xenophon and his fellow Greek soldiers found themselves deep inside the Persian Empire, far from the coast and surrounded by hostile forces. They had no supply line, no friendly depots, and no maps that we would recognize today. Every mile they walked, they had to figure out where the next water source was, whether the villages ahead had markets or would fight them, and which mountain passes were still open before winter snows closed them off. Xenophon writes how they sent out runners to climb high ridges and scan the horizon for smoke or cultivated fields. They interrogated prisoners and local guides, sometimes paying them in silver or trading goods for honest information. A single mistake about the location of a spring could mean hundreds of men collapsing from thirst. A misjudged report about a tribe's loyalty could lead to an ambush that wiped out a whole column. The Greek generals gathered intelligence constantly, not in formal briefings but by listening, observing, and questioning every traveler they met. This kind of planning did not stop at physical terrain. It also meant understanding the human landscape. Which villages were friendly enough to sell grain? Which rulers might try to tax or block the army? Where were the local wells deep enough to supply thousands of men at once, and where were they shallow and likely to run dry? A good commander knew that a seemingly minor detail, like the width of a ford across a river, could determine whether his entire army crossed in a single day or got caught on the wrong bank while the enemy closed in. When you read the accounts of ancient campaigns, the intelligence gathering is almost invisible. It rarely makes it into the dramatic stories of battles and sieges. But it was the quiet foundation beneath every successful march. The general who failed to scout the road ahead did not just risk losing a fight. He risked losing his army to plain hunger and thirst before he ever saw an enemy shield. One commodity sat at the center of every ancient army's survival. It was not gold, iron, or even good boots. It was grain. Wheat, barley, and millet made up the vast majority of a soldier's daily calories, and without them, the strongest warrior became too weak to lift his own shield. A Roman legionary received roughly 2 pounds of wheat each day as his standard ration. That might sound like a lot, but when you grind it into flour and bake it into bread, it becomes the dense, filling energy needed for miles of marching and hours of camp labor. The process of turning that raw grain into something edible was a daily ritual. Soldiers carried hand mills, 2 flat stones that they would grind together to produce coarse flour. Then they would mix it with water and salt, shape it into flat cakes, and bake them over a campfire. The result was hardtack, a bread so tough it could last for weeks without spoiling, but so hard that soldiers often had to soak it in water or wine before they could chew it. For armies on the move, this portable bread was the ultimate traveling food. A single soldier could carry a week's worth of hardtack in his pack, wrapped in cloth or stored in a leather bag. But the sheer weight of grain needed for an entire army was staggering. A legion of 5,000 men required about 15 tons of wheat each day. To transport that much grain, you needed an entire train of wagons and pack animals. A typical Roman supply wagon, pulled by 2 oxen, could carry about 1,000 pounds. That means you would need 30 wagons just to move 1 day's worth of grain for the men. And that is before you factor in the grain needed for the animals themselves, or the grain for officers, servants, and camp followers. Each wagon also had to carry its own spare parts and tools, adding more weight. The result was a slow, creaking column that stretched for miles, vulnerable to ambush and slow to turn. A general had to plan every detail around this flow of grain. He could not march his army into a barren region because there would be nothing to feed the millstones. He could not linger in one spot for long because the grain would run out, and the local farmers could not spare enough to resupply him. He had to coordinate with supply depots along the route where grain had been stockpiled months earlier. Those depots were often granaries built near rivers or ports, so grain could be shipped in by boat, which was far more efficient than overland carts. A single river barge could carry as much grain as 50 wagons, and it did not need to stop to eat. In this way, the geography of rivers and coastlines dictated the paths that armies could take. The grain itself also had to be protected from moisture, pests, and theft. Roman granaries were raised off the ground on stone pillars to keep rats and dampness away. The grain was stored in large clay jars or in pits lined with straw and sealed with clay. When an army arrived at a depot, the quartermasters would distribute the grain in measured portions, often by weight. Each soldier would grind his own ration and bake his own bread, making the legion as much a mobile bakery as a fighting force. This constant reliance on grain shaped not just what soldiers ate, but how far they could go and how fast they could move. A modern analogy might be to think of grain as the gasoline of the ancient world. Without a steady supply, the engine stopped, and unlike a modern fuel truck, the grain supply required constant, grinding labor to turn raw kernels into usable energy. The entire ancient military machine, from the legions of Rome to the phalanxes of Greece, was built around this single, essential ingredient. The next time you see a loaf of bread on a grocery shelf, think of the thousands of miles and the endless calculations that went into feeding a Roman soldier 2,000 years ago. That same humble grain, ground and baked, moved empires across continents. Grain may have been the calorie, but water was the lifeblood, and an army that ran out of water dissolved faster than one that ran out of food. A soldier can survive weeks without a full ration of bread, but only a few days without water, especially under the weight of armor and the glare of a foreign sun. So ancient commanders had to solve an even harder puzzle than carrying grain. They had to move an entire river with them on the march. The simplest solution was to carry water in containers. Roman soldiers each carried a leather canteen called a legna, which held about 3 pints. That was barely enough for half a day in hot weather, so armies also used larger containers loaded onto wagons or pack animals. Goatskins sewn together formed bags that could hold 10 gallons or more, but they leaked, smelled, and had to be kept damp to avoid cracking. Clay pots were heavy and fragile. Wooden barrels, a later innovation, were stronger but still bulky. Even with the best containers, an army could only carry a few days' supply at most. That forced generals to plan their routes around known water sources. Every day's march had to end at a river, a lake, or a chain of wells. In dry regions, this meant following oases or digging wells along the way. The Persians, masters of desert logistics, built an extensive network of underground canals called qanats. These tunnels carried groundwater from the mountains to the plains, often over distances of more than 30 miles. They were dug by hand with shafts every 50 feet for maintenance, and they allowed water to flow without evaporating under the sun. When a Persian army marched, it would draw from these qanats, or if none existed, the soldiers would dig temporary wells. A well team could be sent ahead with shovels and picks to dig a hole 15 feet deep in a dry riverbed. They would line it with stones to prevent collapse and then lower a bucket on a rope. One well might take an entire day to dig and only yield enough water for a few hundred men. For a large army, you needed multiple wells spread across the camp. Alexander the Great faced this challenge during his march through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the most grueling in military history. He had to move his army across 700 miles of barren coastline with almost no water. His scouts would range far ahead, searching for any sign of moisture, a trickle in a dry wash, a patch of green weeds that hinted at underground water. When they found a source, the army would halt for a full day to allow every man and animal to drink and fill every container. Even so, thousands of soldiers perished from thirst and heat sickness. Alexander's engineers also used a technique called condensation pits, dug shallow holes lined with clay, then covered with brush to trap moisture from the night air. It yielded only a few cups per pit, but every drop counted. The Romans took a different approach. They built permanent military aqueducts to supply their frontier forts and marching camps. These were not the massive stone arches you see in Rome itself, but smaller, practical channels made of stone or wood that brought water from nearby springs straight into the camp. A legion on a long campaign would sometimes construct a temporary aqueduct if they stayed in one place long enough, like during a siege. The water would flow into a central cistern, from which soldiers could fill their canteens and water their animals. This system allowed Roman armies to remain in dry regions for weeks or months, something their enemies often could not do. Riverine convoys also played a role. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, armies would load water jars onto boats and sail them along the Nile or the Euphrates, meeting the marching troops at prearranged points. A single barge could carry enough water for 1,000 men for a week. This is why so many ancient campaigns followed rivers. The river provided both a transport highway and a drinking fountain. In the deserts of Arabia and North Africa, water stops were sometimes marked with stone cairns or carved symbols on rocks, telling the next army where to dig. These hidden wells were guarded or kept secret by local tribes. A general had to negotiate or fight for access. The Scythians, a nomadic people, were famous for poisoning wells to slow invaders. That forced armies to carry more water or travel faster. Water logistics did not just limit how far an army could go, it determined the season of war. In summer, rivers dried up and springs shrank. In winter, streams froze. The best time to march was spring and autumn, when water was abundant but temperatures were mild. A commander who ignored these cycles was not just foolish. He was sentencing his own troops to a slow death by thirst. So when you read about Alexander's campaign in the desert or Caesar's conquest of Gaul, remember that every river crossing and every well was a strategic decision. Water was a weapon, a resource, and a limit all at once, and the armies that mastered it did not just survive, they conquered. An army on the march was not just a column of men but a moving herd. Every horse, mule, camel, and elephant required an amount of food that rivaled the grain needed for the soldiers themselves. A single cavalry horse could eat 10 to 20 pounds of hay and barley each day. When you multiply that by thousands of animals, the numbers become a kind of rolling hunger that shaped entire campaigns. The Roman army, for example, kept hundreds of horses for its cavalry and thousands of mules and oxen for its supply wagons. Each day, those animals consumed about twice the weight of fodder as the grain needed for the soldiers. A legion with 1,000 mules could burn through 20,000 pounds of hay and barley in a single day. That is the equivalent of a modern pickup truck loaded to the brim every single day, and the animals had to eat whether or not the army was marching. They could not fast like a soldier could. Their strength came directly from the food they consumed, and a hungry horse or mule would quickly become too weak to carry its load. This is why ancient armies moved in seasons. They could not march through winter because the grass was dead and the hay reserves were low. They could not march through late summer in dry regions because the grazing grounds were scorched. Instead, they followed the green. The grass had to be tall enough to support tens of thousands of animals grazing as they moved. In the spring, when the rains had brought fresh growth, an army could travel faster because the animals could forage along the way. But even then, the grazing had to be carefully managed. A herd of horses could strip a field bare in a matter of hours, so the army had to spread out across a wide front, letting the animals fan out to find scattered patches of grass. That meant the column stretched for miles, and the general had to coordinate where each unit would camp and where the animals would graze. Failure meant the horses would go hungry, and a hungry horse meant a slow cavalry and stalled supply wagons. The Mongols mastered this challenge better than any ancient force. Their horses were smaller and hardier than the big war horses of Europe. They could survive on dry grass, twigs, and even bark in a pinch. A Mongol horse could paw through snow to find frozen grass underneath, but even they had limits. A Mongol army of 100,000 men might have 400,000 horses. The amount of grass needed to sustain that many animals for a single day was staggering. The herd would be spread over miles of terrain, and the army had to keep moving to find fresh pasture. They could not stay in one spot for more than a day or two before the grass was gone. This is why Mongol campaigns were so fast. They were not just moving to outrun the enemy. They were moving to outrun starvation. Camels, used across the deserts of North Africa and the Middle East, had different needs. They could go days without water, but they still needed fodder. They ate dry grasses, thorny shrubs, and even the branches of trees. A camel could consume about 5 to 10 pounds of rough forage daily, but they were not as efficient as horses when it came to converting fodder into energy. The real giants of ancient logistics were the war elephants, used by armies from India to Carthage. An elephant consumed 300 to 600 pounds of food each day. That is roughly the weight of a full-grown cow. They needed vast amounts of grass, leaves, and branches, and they also needed dozens of gallons of water. A single elephant unit could require an entire wagon dedicated to carrying its fodder. For a force of 50 elephants, that meant 15,000 pounds of food daily. This is why elephant armies were usually supported by rivers and lush valleys. They could not operate in dry terrain or through winter. The demand for fodder dictated not just where armies could go, but when. Generals would study the growth cycles of grass in different regions, just as carefully as they studied the roads. They knew that a delay of 2 weeks could mean the difference between lush grazing and dry stubble. Some armies would send foragers ahead to cut grass and bundle it into hay, storing it in depots along the route. Others would negotiate with local villages for grazing rights, often paying in coin or protection. In hostile territory, they would simply take what they needed. but that risked angering the locals and creating a trail of burned fields behind them. The entire movement of ancient armies was a kind of slow dance with the land. The grass, the seasons, and the rivers all set the rhythm, and the general who ignored that rhythm found himself leading a starving army into oblivion. So when you think of a great conquest, think not only of the swords and the shields. Think of the hay and the barley, the endless fields of grass that fed the animals that carried the empire forward. Without them, the march would have stopped at the first dry valley. The marching column of an ancient army was not just a line of soldiers. It was a whole town uprooted and stretched across the landscape, complete with its own markets, workshops, and neighborhoods. Behind the front ranks of infantry and cavalry came the baggage train, a slow and creaky procession that carried the lifeblood of the campaign. Wagon after wagon groaned under stacks of grain sacks, clad jars of oil and wine, bundles of spare spear shafts, and coils of rope. Mules and oxen carried tents made of heavy leather or wool, folded and tied in tight rolls. There were wooden frames for siege engines, spare wheels for carts, and chests of iron nails and hinges for building palisades. Every tool a soldier might need to build a camp or repair his gear was packed somewhere in that winding line. Shovels, axes, pickaxes, and saws went into the same crates as the medical supplies, bundles of linen bandages, jars of wine for cleaning wounds, and pouches of dried herbs that served as early medicines. The column also carried the army's spare weapons, extra swords, bags of arrowheads, replacement shield boards, and bundles of javelins. All of that material had to be organized, loaded, and guarded every step of the way. But the baggage train was only part of the picture. What truly turned an army into a moving city was the throng of civilians who traveled alongside it. Camp followers, as they were called, included sutlers who were traveling merchants selling food, drink, and small luxuries that the military rations did not provide. A hungry soldier could buy fresh bread, dried fruit, or even a cup of watered wine from a sutler's stall set up outside the camp walls. There were artisans too, blacksmiths who could reshoe a horse or mend a broken buckle, armorers who could repair a dented helmet, cobblers who could stitch a torn boot, and carpenters who could build a new wagon wheel. These skilled workers moved with the army, setting up temporary workshops wherever the column halted. Then there were the families. Soldiers often brought their wives and children along on campaign, especially in Roman times. Wives cooked, washed clothes, and tended to the sick. Children ran through the lines, fetching water and gathering firewood. The camp became a noisy, dusty, crowded settlement with its own rhythms and rules. At night, fires glowed in hundreds of spots, and the smells of cooking porridge, roasting meat, and wood smoke filled the air. Tents were arranged in orderly rows, with the commander's pavilion at the center and the sutlers' booths clustered near the gates. This self-contained community could number in the tens of thousands, equal to a medium-sized city of the ancient world. It required its own internal logistics. There were designated water carriers, foragers, and camp police. There were cooks, bakers, and latrine diggers. Everything had to be organized from where animals grazed to where trash was buried. And everyone in that moving city had one thing in common. They all depended on the same flow of supplies that started at the distant granaries and wells far behind the frontier. When that flow stopped, the moving city began to shrink. Sutlers left when there was nothing to sell. Artisans packed up when their materials ran out. Families turned back or starved. The army as a moving city was fragile, held together by the constant movement of food, water, and goods. But when it worked, it was a marvel of ancient planning, a testament to the human ability to create order out of chaos, even on the edge of the known world. The roads of the ancient world were not just paths for marching boots, but living arteries that pumped supplies across empires. The Persian Royal Road stretched over 1,600 miles from Sardis in what is now Turkey to the heart of Persia at Susa. It was not a single paved highway but a chain of well-maintained segments designed for speed and reliability. Way stations stood at intervals of roughly 15 miles, each equipped with fresh horses, fodder, and lodging for couriers and travelers. A rider could change mounts and keep going at a gallop, covering the entire length of the road in 7 to 9 days, a journey that would have taken 3 months on foot. This relay system allowed the Persian king to receive news and send orders faster than any army could march. But the road also moved supplies. Grain wagons could roll along its graded surface without sinking into mud or breaking axles on hidden rocks. Bridges crossed rivers at strategic points, and fortified stations guarded key passes. Mile markers carved with distances, and the name of the reigning king gave every traveler a sense of progress and security. Rest houses offered shelter for soldiers, merchants, and officials, creating a network of small outposts that kept the empire connected even during winter months. The Romans took this concept and turned it into an engineering obsession. Their roads were straight, solid, and built to last. They dug down to bedrock, laid a foundation of large stones, then added layers of gravel and sand, and finally topped it with tightly fitted paving slabs. The top was slightly curved to drain water away. The result was a surface that did not turn into a morass after a rainstorm. A Roman legion could march 20 miles in a day on such a road, sometimes faster if they pushed. Wagons loaded with grain and medical supplies could travel at a steady pace without constant breakdowns. Mile markers, called milestones, were placed every 1,000 paces, roughly 1 Roman mile, and they told the traveler the distance to the nearest city, and often the name of the emperor who built or repaired the road. Alongside the roads, the Romans built way stations called mansions, which offered food, stables, baths, and sleeping quarters for official travelers. Between them were smaller mutations where you could change horses or get a quick meal. This system allowed supplies to be relayed forward like a bucket brigade. A wagon would travel from one station to the next, drop off its cargo, pick up fresh animals, and head back, while another wagon took the goods further. That meant the army never had to carry weeks of supplies from the start. Instead, the supplies leapfrogged along the road network, constantly replenished from depots behind the front. In China, the imperial highways of the Qin and Han dynasties served a similar purpose, but on a scale that matched the size of the realm. The Qin emperor ordered the construction of a network of roads radiating from the capital, some as wide as 50 paces, to allow the rapid movement of troops and grain. Bridges spanned rivers and passes through mountains were widened and fortified. Along these roads, they built post stations every few miles, complete with horses, grain stores, and sleeping quarters for couriers and officials. The Chinese system also used signal towers that could relay messages by smoke or fire, coordinating the movement of supplies across hundreds of miles. One famous road, the Shu Road, cut through the mountains of modern Sichuan using plank pathways bolted to cliff faces. It was a marvel of engineering that allowed grain from the fertile plains to reach the northern frontiers. These road networks turned distant provinces into manageable territory. A general could calculate exactly how many days it would take for a grain shipment to reach his army, and he could trust that the road would not vanish into impassable mud. The roads also allowed him to move troops quickly between theaters, shifting forces to meet threats before they grew large. Without these arteries, the great ancient empires would have been patchworks of isolated regions, unable to project power beyond their heartlands. The road was not just a convenience, it was the silent backbone of every conquest, every supply chain, and every empire that dared to stretch its borders across continents. Rivers were the highways of the ancient world, moving more than any road could carry. A single river barge could haul the same load as 50 wagons, and it did not need to stop for rest or forage for grass. The Romans understood this better than most, and they turned their great rivers into supply superhighways. The Rhine and the Danube formed the spine of the empire's northern frontier, and along their banks the Romans built a network of fleets and fortified docks. Grain from the fertile Black Sea region could be loaded into flat-bottomed boats, sailed up the Danube, and unloaded at legionary forts hundreds of miles inland. The same boats carried barrels of wine, jars of olive oil, and bundles of iron tools. They even transported siege engines, disassembled and packed like giant puzzles, ready to be reassembled at a besieged city. A fleet of these supply ships could keep an entire army fed for months without needing a single wagon to cross a muddy road. The Roman navy, known as the classis, patrolled these rivers and the nearby coastlines, protecting the supply lines from pirates and enemy raiders. They stationed permanent flotillas on the Rhine and Danube with purpose-built warships that could also act as transports. When a frontier legion needed reinforcements, the fastest way to bring them was by boat. Soldiers could rest during the journey and arrive fresh for battle instead of exhausted after a long march. Alexander the Great used the same principle, but on a scale that matched his ambition. He did not just march his army overland. He kept a fleet moving along the Mediterranean coast, carrying grain, siege machinery, and even cavalry horses. This fleet shadowed his army as it advanced through Asia Minor and into Persia. Whenever the land route became too dry or too dangerous, Alexander could fall back on his floating supply line. Ships could anchor at river mouths and offload supplies directly onto the beach. Later, during his invasion of India, he built a fleet on the Hydaspes River to move his army and its supplies downstream, allowing him to strike deep into enemy territory without the slow drag of baggage trains. But perhaps no river was more central to ancient logistics than the Nile. Egypt's great waterway was the bloodline of every pharaoh's campaign. Grain from the rich delta farms was loaded onto barges and moved upstream against the current by using sails and oars or by tugging from the banks using ropes. A single Nile barge could carry enough wheat to feed an entire army for a week. When Egypt launched expeditions into Nubia or the Sinai, the Nile carried the supplies all the way to the frontier, where depots waited to receive them. Even stone for the pyramids was floated down the river, a testament to the sheer capacity of water transport. Without the Nile, Egypt could never have sustained the massive armies that built and defended its empire. Rivers and coastlines turned the impossible into routine. They allowed commanders to dream of marches that would otherwise have been suicide. And they remind us that the true architects of ancient conquest were not always generals on horseback, but the quiet, steady flow of water and the boats that rode upon it. The Roman and Persian armies did not just march with their supplies. They planted supply depots like seeds along their routes. A fortified granary, or what the Romans called a castra stativa, was a permanent supply base built to hold months of grain, barrels of salted meat, jars of oil, and stacks of hay for the animals. These were not just tents pitched for a night. They were stone or timber strongholds with thick walls, guarded towers, and locked storehouses. A Roman legion would build one at a strategic point, a river crossing or a mountain pass, and then stock it with enough provisions to support the army for weeks. When the main force moved deeper into enemy territory, they could send back messages to the depot and have new supplies forwarded to them without relying on random foraging. The Persians did something even more ambitious. Along the Royal Road, they built a chain of these fortified storehouses at regular intervals, each one capable of feeding not just a small garrison but an entire passing army. A general could plan his campaign knowing exactly how many days of marching lay between each depot. He did not have to stop to beg or steal from local farmers. He simply drew from the imperial stockpile. This system freed the army from the land. It meant they could move through barren or hostile regions without slowing down to find food. And it turned the supply chain into a reliable machine, one that could sustain a campaign through a whole summer without interruption. The depots themselves were often built near rivers or ports so that grain could be shipped in bulk and then stored dry. The Romans even had a special type of granary with raised floors and vents to keep the air flowing, preventing mold and insects from destroying the precious food. These forward forts were not just for defense, they were the hidden nodes of an invisible network that allowed armies to project power far beyond their home borders. When you see the ruins of a Roman fort on the edge of a desert or the remnants of a Persian way station, you are looking at the skeleton of an ancient supply line. Without those solid walls and locked granaries, no army could have marched across a continent. They were the quiet anchors that held the entire campaign together. Not every army could afford a chain of depots stretching across the horizon. Some commanders had to feed their men by taking what the land offered, a tactic known as foraging or living off the land. This was a gamble that could either sustain a campaign or doom it in a matter of weeks. The key was understanding the local environment, not just its geography but its seasonal rhythms, its hidden reserves, and its people. A general who misjudged those factors would find his army scattered across hostile territory, weakened by hunger and vulnerable to attack. One of the greatest masters of this art was Hannibal Barca. When he crossed the Alps with tens of thousands of soldiers, elephants, and horses, he left his supply lines behind. He knew that if he dragged a slow baggage train through the mountains, the Gauls would ambush it or the snows would trap it. Instead, he relied on the lands he passed through. His scouts ranged ahead, identifying villages with grain stores, fields of ripe crops, and meadows where animals could graze. Hannibal paid for some supplies, took others by force, and always moved before the region could be stripped bare. He kept his army light and fast, and by the time he descended into Italy, his soldiers were exhausted but not starving. That ability to read the land and take only what was needed without lingering long enough to cause a famine allowed him to campaign on enemy soil for over a decade. The Mongols under Genghis Khan took living off the land to an extreme. Their horses could eat almost anything, and the warriors themselves were trained to survive on dried meat, milk, and blood. But even they needed more than that for extended campaigns. When they invaded China or the Khwarezmian Empire, they would send out clouds of foragers, often covering a front 100 miles wide. These foragers would sweep through farmland, collect grain, drive off livestock, and send the bounty back to the main army. The Mongols were ruthless in their efficiency. They would strip a region of every edible thing and then move on, leaving nothing for the enemy to use. This scorched earth approach had a strategic purpose beyond feeding the army. It made it impossible for local forces to regroup or resupply. The land itself became a weapon, but this method had its own serious risks. The most obvious was dependence on local fertility. If an army marched through a drought-stricken region, a barren desert, or a land already ravaged by previous campaigns, there was simply nothing to take. That was what happened to Napoleon later in history, but ancient generals faced the same trap. When the Roman general Crassus led his legions into the parched plains of Mesopotamia, he discovered that the locals had burned their crops and poisoned the wells. His army was soon starving and demoralized, and his campaign ended in disaster at Carrhae. Foraging also came with a human cost that often backfired. When soldiers took food by force, they angered the local population. What started as a simple raid for grain could spark a guerrilla war. Peasants who had their harvest stolen would hide their remaining supplies, burn their fields, and ambush isolated foragers. Entire armies were ground down by these small attacks. In Gaul, many tribes learned to hide their grain in underground pits or to burn their own villages before Caesar's legions arrived, forcing the Romans to rely on their own supply lines or starve. A commander who could not balance his need for food with the need to keep the people passive was leading his army into a trap. Hannibal succeeded in Italy for years because he often spared the local farms of the Italian allies, hoping to turn them against Rome. When he did take supplies, he tried to leave enough for the people to survive, a delicate calculation that often failed. The best foragers were not those who took everything but those who knew when to take and when to spare. They read the land like a trader reads a market, knowing that one greedy harvest could ruin the entire campaign. Living off the land was the fastest way to move an army without a long supply train, but it demanded a sharp eye, a light hand, and the willingness to walk away before the fields turned to dust. A siege transformed a moving army into a rooted city, and that change placed demands unlike anything the open road could require. When a general decided to besiege a fortress, he committed his troops to staying in one spot for weeks or months, sometimes through an entire season. The supply chain that once flowed at a steady march now had to feed a stationary population of tens of thousands, while also delivering the heavy machinery needed to break stone walls. The challenge was not just carrying enough food, but sustaining a blockade that could outlast the enemy's own reserves. The first burden was artillery. The Romans developed massive siege engines like ballistae, which hurled heavy bolts or stones, and onagers, which could toss a 100-pound rock several hundred yards. These machines were not assembled on site from local timber. The frames, ropes, and torsion springs were crafted in workshops far behind the front and then transported in pieces. A single ballista might require several wagons just for its components. The largest siege towers, like those used at the Siege of Masada or at Alesia, were sometimes built on site using prefabricated joints and beams hauled from forests miles away. Every nail, every rope coil, every leather strap for the torsion bundles had to be accounted for and moved. If a key piece broke during the long transport, the entire siege could be delayed by weeks while a replacement was made and sent forward. But the true weight of a siege fell on the food supply. A blockading army could not forage because it was stuck in one place, eating the same fields bare within days. The Romans at Alesia, under Julius Caesar, surrounded the Gallic stronghold with a double ring of fortifications, an inner wall to pen in the defenders and an outer wall to keep out relief forces. Inside that ring, the Roman army of around 60,000 men needed to be fed constantly. Caesar organized a supply line that stretched back to friendly territory, using a chain of forts and depots. Grain was brought in by wagons from the surrounding region, but the road network was limited, and the army had to secure enough food for months. They also relied on the harvest of nearby farms, but only to a point. The real solution was to build large granaries inside the siege lines, stocked before the blockade began. Caesar wrote that he ordered enough grain to last the entire army for 30 days, and then extended that by commandeering supplies from allied tribes. Even so, the soldiers were often on half rations, and discipline had to be strict to prevent the stores from being wasted. Water was another crisis during a siege. A stationary army of 60,000 men and thousands of animals might need over 100,000 gallons of fresh water every day. The Romans at Alesia dug wells inside their fortifications and built aqueducts to channel water from nearby streams. If those sources were contaminated or cut off by the enemy, the army would collapse in days. Caesar's engineers also constructed cisterns lined with clay to catch rainwater. The defenders inside Alesia had their own water problems, which eventually forced their surrender. The Mongols faced similar logistical puzzles during their sieges, but they solved them with speed and terror. They did not usually build vast permanent siege lines. Instead, they used catapults, trebuchets, and battering rams that were often constructed on the spot from local timber. Mongol engineers, many of them captured from Chinese or Persian campaigns, were experts at assembling these machines quickly. They also used a technique called the siege train, where prefabricated components were carried on pack animals and reassembled at the target. A Mongol army could arrive at a city, assemble a dozen trebuchets within days, and begin bombardment almost immediately. Their supply chain for food was the same as on the open march. They lived off the land and used their herds. But for a siege that lasted weeks, they also relied on captured grain from the surrounding countryside. And they were masters of psychological warfare, often sending envoys to demand surrender, offering a choice between submission and total destruction. When a city resisted, the Mongols would blockade it tightly, cutting off all food and water, and then wait. The siege of Nishapur in 1221, for example, lasted only a few days after the Mongols built their machines and began bombardment. The defenders surrendered when they saw the scale of the assault. The key difference between a siege and a field campaign was time. On the march, an army could keep moving to find fresh resources. In a siege, it had to make a single spot work for months. That meant stockpiling, rationing, and maintaining a constant flow of supplies from the rear. The failure of siege logistics meant not just defeat, but starvation and disease within the besieging force itself. The success of a siege often depended less on the bravery of the attackers and more on the quiet, grinding work of the quartermasters who kept the grain and water coming day after day until the walls fell. Alexander the Great redesigned military logistics from the ground up. When he set out to conquer the Persian Empire, he knew that the old model of slow, creaking baggage trains would never allow him to outmaneuver an enemy that controlled the entire landmass. So he stripped his army of unnecessary weight and replaced heavy wagons with lighter, faster vehicles. His standard supply cart was a two-wheeled cart pulled by a single mule or horse, capable of carrying about 400 pounds of grain or equipment. These carts were narrow enough to pass through mountain passes and durable enough to survive rough terrain. By using hundreds of these light carts instead of the massive ox-drawn wagons favored by the Persians, Alexander could move his army at a pace that shocked his enemies. He also insisted that each soldier carry a certain amount of his own rations, typically enough for several days. Every infantryman in his phalanx carried a small bag of ground barley or wheat, along with a simple cooking pot. This meant the army could march for days without needing to stop for the supply train to catch up. When the army did pause, the light carts could be unloaded quickly, and the soldiers could grind their own grain and bake bread on the spot. The result was a force that could cover up to 20 miles a day, even in rough country, faster than any comparable army of the time. But Alexander did not rely solely on land transport. He understood the value of the sea. During his march along the Mediterranean coast of Asia Minor and then into Phoenicia, he kept a fleet of supply ships sailing parallel to his army. These ships hugged the shoreline, staying within sight of the land, and they carried bulk goods that would have been impossible to move overland. Barrels of wine, jars of olive oil, salted fish, and even spare weapons were loaded onto these vessels. When the army reached a coastal plain or a natural harbor, the ships would drop anchor and offload their cargo directly onto the beach. This gave Alexander a floating supply depot that moved with him, immune to the ambushes that plagued land-based trains. He could feed his army from the sea while the land route remained free of heavy loads. The ships also allowed him to transport siege equipment in pieces. The massive battering rams and catapults used to break down Persian city walls were often too large for the light carts. Instead, they were dismantled, loaded onto the ships, and reassembled when needed. The Siege of Tyre, one of the most famous in history, relied heavily on this naval supply line. Ships brought timber, stone, and workers from Cyprus and Phoenicia, allowing Alexander to build a causeway across the sea and bring his machines within range of the island fortress. His strategic depots were equally innovative. Before his main army ever crossed into Asia Minor, Alexander had already sent advance teams to establish supply bases at key locations. These were not just random storehouses. They were carefully chosen spots near rivers or ports where grain could be stockpiled in advance. One such depot was at the old Lydian capital of Sardis, which surrendered without a fight. Alexander immediately took control of its granaries and used them to feed his army for weeks. As he moved east, he left small garrisons behind to protect these depots, ensuring that if he ever needed to retreat or resupply, the food would be waiting. He also forced captured Persian treasuries to fund the purchase of more grain from local farmers, turning enemy gold into logistical fuel. What made Alexander's system work was not just the hardware but the adaptability. When he needed to cross a desert or a mountain range where ships could not go and depots did not exist, he would send out fast cavalry units to forage far ahead. Those units would identify water sources, buy or seize grain, and then ride back to guide the main column to the next stop. This blend of planning and improvisation allowed him to keep his army moving at a pace that left the Persians confused and outmaneuvered. In one famous example, his army crossed the Gedrosian Desert with the help of a chain of carefully spaced wells that had been dug by advance parties months earlier. The soldiers knew that if they reached a certain point by nightfall, water would be there. That kind of foresight turned a potential disaster into a manageable hardship. Alexander's logistics were not about carrying everything from home. They were about creating a system that could change based on the ground, the season, and the enemy. He treated his supply chain not as a fixed burden but as a living, breathing part of his army, one that could speed up when he needed to chase, slow down when he needed to besiege, and even vanish into the sea when the land became too hostile. That flexibility was the secret behind his lightning conquests, and it remains a lesson for any organization that needs to move fast over long distances. Rome took the lessons of supply and turned them into a permanent institution. While Alexander relied on brilliant improvisation, the Roman Empire built a machine that could feed legions for generations without depending on the genius of a single commander. At the heart of that machine stood two systems, the cursus publicus and the annona. The cursus publicus was the imperial courier and transport network, a state-run system of roads, way stations, and authorized vehicles that moved official messages, officials, and critical supplies across the provinces. It was not open to just anyone. Only those carrying a special permit called a diploma could use its horses, wagons, and resting places. This kept the system efficient and reserved for military and government business. Along the major roads, stations called mansions were spaced about a day's march apart, offering fresh horses, food, and lodging. Between them, smaller mutations allowed couriers to swap tired animals without stopping overnight. A rider carrying orders from the emperor could travel up to 50 miles a day, changing horses every few hours. This speed meant that a crisis on the frontier could be reported and answered in days, not weeks. But the cursus publicus was not just for messages. It also transported grain, weapons, and other bulk goods. Wagons pulled by oxen or mules moved supplies from provincial granaries to legionary depots, using the same network of roads and stations. The cost of maintaining this network was enormous, but the empire considered it essential for holding its vast territories together. The second pillar was the annona, originally a grain dole for the city of Rome, but it evolved into a military supply system known as the annona militaris. This was a dedicated tax collected in grain from the provinces and stored in state granaries for the exclusive use of the army. Every province with agricultural surplus was required to contribute a fixed amount of wheat or barley each year. The grain was then transported, often by sea or river, to military zones. In Egypt, the harvest was so critical that the emperor appointed a special prefect to oversee its collection and shipment. Ships from Alexandria carried tons of grain across the Mediterranean to the legions stationed in Britain, Germany, and Syria. The annona militaris removed the guesswork from feeding an army. A general no longer had to negotiate with local farmers or hope for a good harvest. The grain was already there, stockpiled in fortified granaries, waiting for his requisition order. This system also allowed the empire to move legions quickly. Because the grain was pre-positioned, a legion could march from one end of the empire to the other without stopping to forage. They simply drew from the next depot along the route, but the state could not do everything alone. Private contractors called negotiators filled the gaps. These were merchants who won contracts to supply the army with everything the state did not provide: fresh meat, vegetables, wine, clothing, leather, and even luxury goods for officers. They traveled with the legions, setting up markets near the camps. The empire regulated their prices and profits, but allowed them to operate because they were essential. A legionary could buy a warm cloak from a negotiator before a winter campaign, or a bit of wine to soften his hardtack. These contractors also transported goods that the state bureaucracy found too cumbersome or urgent. If a legion needed extra nails for building a fort, or a shipment of arrows before an expected battle, the negotiators could move faster than the official channels. They had their own wagons, mules, and networks of local suppliers. Over time, some negotiators became wealthy and influential, acting as bankers and financiers for the legions. The cursus publicus, the annona militaris, and the negotiators formed a three-layered supply system that was flexible, redundant, and incredibly resilient. If the state granaries ran low, the contractors could buy from local markets. If the official couriers were delayed, private messengers could carry urgent orders. This system allowed Rome to maintain over 300,000 soldiers across 3 continents, year after year, without the kind of supply collapses that had destroyed earlier empires. The legions did not just march on their stomachs, they marched on a network of roads, taxes, and merchants that had been engineered as carefully as any aqueduct. And it worked for centuries until the empire itself began to fray. The Mongol system was built on a completely different foundation. While Rome and Persia relied on fixed roads and permanent granaries, the Mongols carried their supply chain on 4 legs. Their entire way of life on the steppe was a living pantry that moved with them. Herds of horses, sheep, goats, and yaks provided meat, milk, cheese, and blood on the hoof. A Mongol warrior could travel for days without stopping to cook or forage, because he carried dried curds and a leather pouch of arag, a fermented mare's milk that was both food and drink. When his dried rations ran low, he could simply tap a horse's vein and mix the blood with water. This meant the army did not need supply wagons at all. The animals themselves were the supply wagons. A typical Mongol campaign might involve each soldier bringing 4 or 5 horses, rotating rides so they could cover astonishing distances without tiring the animals. When one horse was exhausted, the warrior switched to a fresh one, and the tired animal followed at a slower pace. This allowed the army to move up to 60 or 70 miles in a single day, a speed that left even the fastest Roman legions behind in dust. But the Mongols did not rely only on their own herds. They also used a network of relay stations called the Yam, which stretched across the empire from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea. This system was not just for messages, as the Persian Royal Road had been, but for actual supplies and troop movements. At each Yam station, the Mongols kept stockpiles of grain, dried meat, and fodder for the horses, along with fresh mounts ready for any rider or official carrying a paser, a metal tablet that authorized travel. The stations were spaced roughly 20 to 30 miles apart, a day's ride for a single horse. A courier could ride hard between stations, hand off his message to a fresh rider, and rest while the message continued at full speed. This relay could carry news across the entire empire in a matter of days. But the Yam also moved physical goods. Merchants, diplomats, and military supply convoys could draw from the stores at each station, replenishing their own packs without having to carry everything from the start. The Mongols even set up a system of tax exemptions for those who maintained the Yam, encouraging local communities to keep the stations stocked and staffed. This blend of mobile pastoralism and fixed relay points gave the Mongols a logistical paradox. They could move like lightning across open plains, yet still have access to supply depots when they needed them. The secret was that the yam stations were not there to feed the entire army. They were there to feed the most critical element, the horses. A Mongol army on the move could graze its animals on the grass of the steppe, but when it entered arid regions or was racing toward a target, the stations provided concentrated feed like barley or hay. That allowed the horses to keep their strength even when the land was barren. The result was an army that could appear where it was least expected, strike with overwhelming force, and then vanish before the enemy could organize a response. The Mongols did not win by outlasting their supply lines. They won by moving so fast that supply lines barely mattered. The yam and the mobile herds together formed a system that was both ancient and utterly modern in its efficiency, a network of living food and fixed fuel that allowed a handful of horsemen to rule the largest contiguous empire in history. Hannibal's crossing of the Alps remains one of the most audacious logistical gambles in history. He set out from Spain with a force that included tens of thousands of infantry, cavalry, and 37 war elephants, but he had no secure supply line stretching back to Carthage. There was no chain of depots, no fleet of supply ships waiting on the coast, and no friendly territory to fall back on. From the moment he entered the mountains, every grain of food and every drop of water had to be taken from the land or carried on the backs of his animals. The baggage train that followed his column was a floating storehouse of captured Roman supplies. Earlier in his campaign, Hannibal had won several skirmishes against local tribes and Roman patrols, and he used those victories to stock his pack animals with grain, wine, and spare equipment. His mules and horses carried bags of barley, dried meat, and even bundles of fodder for themselves. Every animal was a moving pantry, and every soldier carried a small sack of rations in his own pack. But the mountains tested this fragile system to its breaking point. Narrow passes forced the column to stretch for miles, and the pack animals often slipped on icy paths, sending their precious loads tumbling into ravines. Snow covered the grass, so the horses and mules went hungry. Many died from exhaustion and cold, their bodies left behind because there was no time to cut them for meat. The elephants, already struggling with the altitude and unfamiliar terrain, consumed enormous amounts of fodder that had to be carried or gathered along the way. Hannibal's own guides, local Gallic tribesmen, sometimes led him into ambushes or dead ends, forcing the army to backtrack and waste days of rations. By the time he emerged onto the plains of northern Italy, his army was a shadow of its former size. He had lost thousands of men, many of his pack animals, and most of his elephants. Those who survived carried only what they could walk with, and their stomachs were nearly empty. Yet Hannibal had one critical advantage. The Gallic tribes of the Po Valley were hostile to Rome and eager to ally with anyone who promised to weaken the Republic. Over the next weeks and months, these allies provided Hannibal with grain, livestock, and fresh horses. They opened their granaries and allowed his army to rest and refit. This local support transformed his campaign. Instead of starving in a foreign land, he suddenly had a base of operations, a source of food, and a steady flow of recruits. For over a decade, Hannibal lived off the land and off the hospitality of his Gallic and Italian allies. He moved his army through the Italian countryside, winning battles at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae, each time capturing Roman supplies and adding them to his own. The Roman economy of war depended on centralized granaries and fortified depots. Hannibal's strategy was to shatter that system by proving that no Roman army could protect its own supply lines. At Cannae, he destroyed a Roman army of perhaps 50,000 men, but he could not follow up that victory with a siege of Rome itself. The reason was logistics. He simply did not have the siege equipment or the food reserves to surround and starve the capital. His army was still living day to day, relying on the goodwill of allies who grew tired of feeding him. And the Romans, learning from their disasters, changed their own strategy. They stopped meeting Hannibal in open battle and instead shadowed his army, cutting off his foragers, attacking his supply parties, and burning the fields he needed to feed his men. A Roman general named Fabius Maximus earned the nickname the Delayer because he refused to fight, but he understood that Hannibal's army was a parasite. It could only survive as long as the host body of Italian agriculture kept producing. The Romans began to systematically deny that food source. They ordered the countryside to be stripped, grain to be stored in fortified towns, and livestock to be driven behind city walls. Hannibal's foragers found empty fields and locked granaries. His Gallic allies, faced with Roman reprisals, began to drift away. The supply of grain and fresh horses dwindled. Hannibal's army grew smaller, hungrier, and less mobile. He could not replace his losses because Carthage sent few reinforcements. The sea routes were too dangerous, and the Roman navy controlled the coast. In the end, Hannibal's campaign was not broken by a single defeat on a battlefield. It was ground down by 1,000 small failures, a field that had been burned, a village that refused to sell grain, a Gallic chieftain who switched sides. The Great March across the Alps became a fading memory as his army shrank into a rump force, trapped in the toe of Italy, unable to move forward or back. The logistical marvel that had allowed him to cross a mountain range could not sustain a war of attrition against an enemy that controlled its own homeland. When he finally sailed back to Carthage, he left behind a land that had been bled dry by a decade of foraging, and a lesson that even the most brilliant commander cannot outrun the simple math of food and distance. Darius and Xerxes commanded the largest armies the ancient world had ever seen. When Xerxes crossed into Greece in 480 before the Common Era, his force may have included 200,000 soldiers and tens of thousands of support personnel, all moving together like a slow, hungry tide. To feed such a multitude, the Achaemenid Persians had built a logistical system that was as impressive as any battlefield victory. At its heart was the Royal Road, a highway that stretched over 1,600 miles from the Aegean coast all the way to the Persian heartland. Along this road stood more than 111 way stations, each one stocked with fresh horses, grain, and supplies. The road was not a single paved strip but a series of well-maintained segments that allowed couriers and supply wagons to move at a steady pace. A message could travel the entire length in about a week, but more importantly, the road allowed the Persians to position grain depots at regular intervals. A general marching an army along the Royal Road knew that every few days his men would reach a station where they could draw rations, replace tired pack animals, and rest. This system transformed the road into a living pipeline that could sustain a moving force for months without requiring them to stop and forage. But the Persians did not stop at land routes. Darius the Great, who ruled before Xerxes, also ordered the construction of a canal connecting the Nile River to the Red Sea. This was an early version of what would later become the Suez Canal, and it allowed Persian ships to move grain and supplies from the rich farmlands of Egypt directly to the Red Sea coast. From there, goods could be shipped to ports on the Persian Gulf or up the Indus River. The canal was wide enough for two triremes to pass side by side, and it was maintained by a dedicated workforce. It turned Egypt into a strategic supply hub that could feed armies operating in Arabia, India, or even the Eastern Mediterranean. Xerxes used a similar canal when he invaded Greece, cutting a channel across the isthmus of Mount Athos to bypass a dangerous stretch of sea. That canal was wide enough for two warships and allowed his fleet to stay close to his land forces, ensuring that grain and water could travel by sea rather than over the difficult mountain passes. The secret behind Persian supply chains, however, was not just roads and canals but people. The empire was divided into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap. These local governors were required to stockpile grain, hay, and other supplies in fortified storehouses throughout their territory. When the king decided to launch a campaign, he would send out orders to each satrap along the proposed route. The satraps would then prepare the depots, collecting taxes in kind from local farmers and storing them in strongholds. By the time the army arrived, the grain was already waiting, often for months before the first soldier set foot on the road. This system meant that the huge invasion force did not have to carry all its food from home. It drew from a chain of local storehouses that had been prepared in advance. The local farmers and merchants were compensated, or at least not entirely stripped, because the Persians understood that a ruined province could not support a second campaign. This careful planning allowed Xerxes to move his immense army across Asia Minor and into Thrace without the kind of desperate foraging that had plagued Hannibal. But even this magnificent system had its limits. The sheer size of the army meant that the depots could only support it for a limited time. When the Persians reached Greece, they had to move fast because the local storehouses were designed for a fixed number of days. Any delay, like the standoff at Thermopylae, burned through those supplies. The Persians could not afford to linger, and after their defeat at Salamis, the supply chain that had carried them so far began to falter. The fleet could no longer protect the grain ships. The satraps in the rear grew reluctant to send more provisions. The army that had seemed unstoppable began to shrink, not from battle alone, but from the slow, silent failure of its own logistical backbone. The Persian system was a marvel of organization, but it was still bound by the same laws that governed every ancient force. The distance a wagon could roll, the weight a mule could carry, and the number of days a depot could feed a hungry army. The Chinese approach to military logistics was built on a scale that matched the vastness of the empire itself. The warriors buried in the terracotta army near the first emperor's tomb were not just symbols of power. They represented a real fighting force that could only exist because of an astonishing administrative and engineering network. The Grand Canal, which would eventually stretch over 1,000 miles, began as a series of linked waterways designed to move grain from the fertile Yangtze River Valley to the arid north where the capital and the armies were stationed. This canal system was an artificial river that allowed barges loaded with rice and wheat to bypass the slow, dangerous overland routes. A single barge on the canal could carry as much as 50 wagons, and it moved far faster because it did not need to stop for rest or to feed animals. The Qin and Han dynasties built a bureaucracy that tracked every grain of rice from the field to the soldier's bowl. Local officials were required to report harvest yields, and the state operated massive granaries, some capable of holding millions of bushels, built with raised floors and ventilated walls to keep the grain dry and safe from pests. These granaries were not just storehouses, they were strategic reserves that could feed an army for months without relying on the current season's crop. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, standardized weights, measures, and even the width of cart axles so that supply wagons could roll smoothly along the empire's new road network. His administrators used a system of seals and tallies to track every shipment, creating a paper trail that allowed the central government to know exactly how much grain was in each province and how long it would last. When a legion was mobilized, the bureaucracy could calculate exactly how many days of rations were needed and send orders to the nearest granaries. The supply chain was not just about moving food. It was about moving information, and the Chinese Empire mastered the art of paperwork long before any other civilization. This administrative genius is one reason the Qin and Han were able to field armies of hundreds of thousands and project power across a territory larger than the Roman Empire. The silent rows of the terracotta army are a reminder that behind every ancient warrior stood not just a farmer, but a scribe, a canal builder, and a state that knew exactly how to keep its soldiers fed. The Nile was not just a river, it was a moving warehouse that carried the weight of an empire. Every year, the floodwaters of the Nile deposited rich black silt across the floodplains of Egypt, turning the narrow strip of green into the most productive farmland in the ancient world. This predictable cycle allowed the pharaohs to stockpile grain on a scale that made other kingdoms envious. Massive granaries, built of mud brick with raised floors and tight seals, dotted the banks of the river. They held enough wheat and barley to feed an army for months, even through a poor harvest. When the pharaoh decided to send a force into Palestine or Nubia, he did not have to rely on the goodwill of local farmers or the chance of a good season. The grain was already there, waiting, but the real genius of Egyptian logistics was the river itself. The Nile flowed from south to north, while the prevailing winds blew from north to south. This meant a barge could sail downstream with the current and then return upstream under sail, creating a two-way highway that required almost no human effort to move goods. A single Nile barge, called a baris, could carry several tons of grain, enough to feed 1,000 soldiers for a week. These barges were shallow enough to navigate the shifting channels and could be loaded directly at the granary docks. The army would march along the riverside while the supply barges kept pace, dropping off rations at prearranged stops. When the expedition reached the border fortress at Sicily or the ports along the Red Sea, the barges would offload their cargo into fortified storehouses. From there, pack animals or smaller craft would carry the supplies further into desert or coastal territory. This system allowed Egyptian armies to operate hundreds of miles from the Nile Valley without the slow, grinding baggage trains that plagued other ancient forces. The river was the supply line, and it was always full. In Mesopotamia, the twin rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates served a similar purpose, but with a twist. Their floods were less predictable than the Nile, sometimes violent and destructive, sometimes too weak to water the fields. The Assyrians and Babylonians built an intricate network of canals to control the flow, directing water to grain fields and linking the rivers to their capitals. These canals doubled as transport arteries. Grain from the rich fields of northern Mesopotamia could be loaded onto flat-bottomed boats and floated downstream to the heart of the empire at Nineveh or Babylon. The canals also connected to smaller tributaries, creating a web of waterways that reached deep into the countryside. When the Assyrian king launched a campaign into the Levant or the Zagros Mountains, his army would march along the rivers or the canal banks while supply boats followed close by. The boats carried not just grain but also timber for siege engines, bundles of reed arrows, and jars of beer and oil. The rivers allowed the Assyrians to project power far beyond their heartland, turning what would have been a dry, hostile march into a journey with a floating pantry. But the rivers had their limits. They could only carry supplies as far as the water flowed. Once an army moved into the arid plateaus of Anatolia or the deserts of Arabia, the boats had to turn back and the soldiers had to carry their own provisions. That is why Assyrian campaigns often followed the course of a river as far as possible, then established a base camp at the farthest navigable point, stocked with supplies brought by the fleet. From that base, the army would strike out on a limited time window, carrying enough food for a few weeks before they had to return to the river or starve. The great river civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia had mastered the art of supply, but their reach was always tethered to the water. The Nile and the Tigris-Euphrates gave them the ability to feed armies that could march for months, yet never truly free them from the banks that gave them life. Behind every great march stood a force that rarely gets the glory, the military engineer. These were the men who turned impossible terrain into passable ground, who threw bridges across raging rivers, who carved roads through mountain passes, and who built a new city every single night. Without them, the grandest supply chains would have stalled at the first riverbank or the first rock slide. The Roman army understood this so deeply that every legion included a dedicated corps of engineers, the fabri, who were trained in carpentry, masonry, and hydraulics. They were not just laborers, they were skilled craftsmen who could survey a site, calculate the strength of a beam, and direct thousands of soldiers in construction work. When Caesar needed to cross the Rhine to intimidate the German tribes, his engineers built a timber bridge over the wide, fast-flowing river in just 10 days. They drove piles into the riverbed, lashed beams together, and laid a roadway that could support marching legions and heavy wagons. The bridge was not meant to last forever. It served its purpose, allowed Caesar to project power, and then was dismantled. That kind of temporary but robust construction was the hallmark of Roman military engineering. Every night, no matter how tired the soldiers were, the legion would build a fortified camp. The engineers would mark out the perimeter with measuring rods, and then the men would dig a ditch, pile the earth into a rampart, and plant wooden stakes on top. By morning, the army had a defensible base with gates, streets, and designated areas for tents and supplies. These camps were miniature cities, complete with a headquarters, a market, and latrines. The engineers designed them to be built quickly and efficiently, using standardized plans that every soldier knew by heart. This meant the army could move into hostile territory and still have a secure place to sleep and store food every single night. The Persians were equally skilled, but they specialized in bridging the impossible. When Xerxes invaded Greece, his engineers built a pontoon bridge across the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separates Asia from Europe. They lashed hundreds of ships together side by side, laid planks across the decks, and created a floating road wide enough for wagons and cavalry. The first attempt failed when a storm destroyed the ropes. Xerxes, according to historians, ordered the engineers whipped and the sea itself punished with chains. But then they built a second bridge, stronger and more carefully anchored, and the entire army crossed into Europe. That bridge was an engineering marvel, a temporary structure that solved the problem of moving a massive force across a difficult water barrier. It allowed the Persians to bring their enormous supply train directly into the Greek mainland, rather than relying on a slow, vulnerable fleet. Pontoon bridges became a staple of ancient warfare. The Romans used them on the Danube and the Rhine, and later armies copied the technique for centuries. But engineers also built permanent infrastructure that lasted long after the army left. Military roads, like those of the Romans, were often constructed by legionaries under the direction of engineers. They cut through forests, drained swamps, and graded hills to create a smooth, all-weather surface. Along these roads, they built stone bridges with arches that could carry heavy loads and withstand floods. Some of those bridges still stand today, and when an army needed water, the engineers built temporary aqueducts using wooden channels or stone conduits. During a siege, they would run water from a nearby spring into the camp, ensuring a steady supply even if the enemy controlled the riverbanks. The engineers also constructed siege towers, battering rams, and catapults, often on site using local timber and iron brought by the supply train. They could assemble a tower 70 feet high in a matter of weeks, covering it with wet hides to protect against fire, and then roll it up to the enemy walls. All of this required precise planning, careful measurement, and a deep understanding of materials. The military engineer was the unsung hero of every campaign, the one who turned the general's vision into a physical path. When you look at the ruins of Roman roads or the remains of a Persian causeway, you are seeing the handiwork of men who understood that the best way to conquer a continent was to first build a way across it. The animals that carried the weight of ancient armies were as diverse as the lands they crossed, and each creature brought its own set of strengths and hidden costs. The humble ox was the workhorse of choice for many early civilizations, prized for its raw pulling power and its ability to survive on coarse grass that would starve a horse. A pair of oxen could drag a cart weighing over a ton, laden with grain barrels or timbers for siege engines, and they did so at a steady, patient pace. They were also cheap to maintain because they did not need expensive grain or constant grooming, but the great weakness of the ox was its speed. An ox team moved at barely 2 miles per hour, and they required frequent rest. A legion relying on ox-drawn wagons could cover only 10 or 12 miles in a day, far slower than the soldiers themselves could march. In hostile territory, that slow pace made the supply train an easy target for raiders. Oxen also had a stubborn temperament, refusing to move when exhausted or frightened. More than one Roman convoy was delayed by a team of oxen that simply lay down in the middle of a road and would not rise. The mule, by contrast, was the all-terrain vehicle of the ancient world. Bred from a horse and a donkey, mules combined the sure-footedness of a donkey with the size and strength of a horse. They could pick their way along narrow mountain paths where a wagon would tumble, and they could carry loads of up to 200 pounds on their backs without complaint. Mules were also tough. They could survive on poorer forage than a horse and were less likely to panic under fire. Roman armies used mules by the thousands, often in long strings of a dozen or more, each tied to the tail of the one ahead. A single muleteer could manage a whole string, which meant fewer human attendants to feed and pay. The downside was that mules were notoriously stubborn and could be difficult to handle. They were also slower than horses and less impressive in appearance, which mattered for cavalry units that needed to project power. But for the grunt work of carrying grain, tents, and spare weapons, the mule was indispensable. Camels belonged to a different world entirely. They were the specialists of the desert, capable of going for days without water and eating thorny scrub that would cut a horse's mouth. A single camel could carry a load of 400 pounds, twice what a mule could manage, and it could travel for a week on a single good drink. This made them the backbone of Persian, Arab, and later Mongol supply lines across arid regions. When Alexander the Great marched through the Gedrosian desert, he used camels to carry water skins and grain, saving the lives of thousands of soldiers. Camels also had an advantage in hot climates because they did not need the constant shade and water that horses required, but they had their own serious limitations. Camels were slow, with a walking pace similar to an ox. They were also difficult to handle for soldiers not raised with them. Their smell could spook horses, and their temperament was notoriously unpredictable. A camel could bite, kick, or simply refuse to rise when loaded, sometimes without warning. And in cold or wet climates, camels suffered terribly. Their bodies were not built for rain or frost, and they would sicken quickly in the damp highlands of Europe. This is why you never see camels in Roman Britain or in the forests of Gaul. Horses, on the other hand, were the thoroughbreds of ancient logistics. They were fast, responsive, and inspiring. A cavalry horse could carry a rider at speeds that outran any enemy, and they were essential for scouting, messenger duty, and shock attacks. But horses came with a staggering cost. Each horse ate 10 to 20 pounds of grain and hay every day, far more than a mule or ox. They needed clean water constantly, and their hooves required regular care. A horse that was not fed properly would weaken in a matter of days. Horses also could not survive on poor forage. They needed high-quality feed to maintain their strength. This made them expensive to maintain and limited their use to elite units or short-duration campaigns. A Roman cavalry unit could only operate effectively if it had a secure supply of barley and hay, which meant the entire logistics system had to prioritize the horses ahead of many other needs. Then there were the elephants. These were the prestige animals of ancient warfare, used by Carthaginians, Indians, and the Hellenistic kingdoms. An elephant could carry a heavy tower with archers on its back, and it could break an infantry line simply by charging. But feeding an elephant was a monumental task. A single adult elephant consumed 300 to 600 pounds of vegetation each day, along with 50 gallons of water. That is the equivalent of feeding a whole platoon of soldiers. An army with 50 elephants needed as much fodder as a force of several thousand men. Transporting that fodder required its own dedicated supply line. Moreover, elephants were slow, with a marching speed that matched an ox but required far more rest. They were also difficult to replace as they took years to mature and were hard to train. When an elephant died, the investment was lost permanently. And despite their fearsome reputation, elephants were not always reliable in battle. They could panic, trample their own troops, and flee uncontrollably. In the end, the choice of animal was never just about speed or strength. It was a calculation of the whole territory, the season, and the mission. A general marching through mountains would stock up on mules. One crossing a desert would pray for camels. An invading force planning a quick strike might rely on horses and light carts, while a siege army would bring oxen and accept the slow pace. Every animal had its price, and every commander had to pay it, pound by pound, mile after mile, across the length of the ancient world. The calendar itself was as much a weapon as any sword. Armies were prisoners of the seasons, and a general who ignored the farmer's rhythm was asking for ruin. Across every ancient empire, the timing of a campaign was dictated by three forces that no amount of courage could overcome: the harvest, the rivers, and the weather. Spring was the season of war. After the winter snows melted and the first crops were planted, the grain from the previous autumn's harvest still filled the granaries. The roads were drying out, the rivers were high but not flooded, and the grass was fresh and green. Armies could march without the animals starving, and they could draw on the stored grain of the previous year without competing with the new planting. Roman legions typically left their winter quarters in March or April, just as the first buds appeared. They had a window of about 4 months before the harvest season in late summer would call them back, not because they wanted to rest, but because the land could not support them any longer. Harvest time was sacred. Every soldier in a Roman or Greek army was also a farmer, or at least depended on one. When the grain in the fields ripened in July and August, the army had to stop campaigning. The farmers needed to bring in the crop, and the military supply depots depended on that new grain to fill their storehouses for the next year. An army that stayed in the field past the harvest risked depleting the very food it would need to survive the winter. More than one commander watched his campaign stall, not because of enemy action, but because his men were needed at home to bring in the barley. Rivers were just as fickle. In spring, melting snows swelled the streams, making them wider and faster. That was good for transport, since boats could float deeper loads, but it also made crossing more dangerous. By midsummer, many rivers shrank to a trickle, exposing sandbars and dry beds that blocked barge traffic. A general who planned to use a river as his supply line had to launch his campaign early enough to take advantage of the high water, but not so early that the roads were still mud from the thaw. It was a narrow window, often only a few weeks wide. Weather itself was an unforgiving overseer. In the Mediterranean world, the summer sun baked the land, turning streams into dust and wilting the grass. Armies marched at night or in the early morning to avoid the worst heat, but even then, water consumption soared and men collapsed. Autumn brought rains that turned roads into mires, slowing wagons to a crawl. But the true enemy was winter. Snows blocked mountain passes, rivers froze, and grazing grounds disappeared under white. No ancient army could sustain a campaign through a northern winter. Animals died by the hundreds, wood became scarce for fires, and supplies could not reach the front. The Romans, for all their discipline, almost never fought major battles in December or January. They planted their legions in winter camps, hunkered down, and waited for spring. The few generals who dared break these rhythms invited catastrophe. The Roman general Varus, who led 3 legions into the Teutoburg forest in the autumn of 9 of the Common Era, marched too late in the year. The rains turned the forest paths into mud, slowing his column and making it impossible for his supply wagons to keep pace. The German tribes, knowing the terrain, attacked when the Romans were strung out and exhausted, and the legions were annihilated. It was not just an ambush. It was a logistical trap sprung by the season itself. Even the Mongols, who prided themselves on year-round mobility, respected the grass. Their horses could paw through light snow, but deep drifts or a long winter freeze could kill entire herds. Genghis Khan timed his great invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire to begin in the spring, when the steppe grass was thick and the rivers were flowing. He knew that a winter campaign in the mountains of Afghanistan would have destroyed his army, no matter how many cities he captured. The seasons were the silent generals of every ancient war, dictating when armies could move, when they could rest, and when they had to retreat. A commander who learned to read the land, the rivers, and the calendar had a weapon that was invisible but absolute. And those who ignored it found that nature itself was the most unforgiving enemy of all. A general could not see his own supply lines stretching back over the horizon, and that blindness was the most dangerous weakness of all. The success of every march, every battle, every siege depended on information flowing faster than the army itself moved. Without knowing whether the next depot still had grain, whether a river had flooded a wagon road, or whether the enemy had cut off a forager party, a commander was leading a blind column into the unknown. The ancient world solved this problem with a network of messengers, signals, and relay systems that kept the army connected to its own tail. The Romans relied heavily on tuba signals. The tuba was a long, straight brass horn that could produce clear, penetrating notes. Different patterns of notes meant different commands. One sequence might mean forage parties had encountered the enemy and needed reinforcements. Another might signal that the supply wagons were under attack and the legion had to form a defensive circle. The sound carried for miles over open ground, and every soldier knew the meaning of each call. But the tuba was only good for short-range communication within the column. For longer distances, the Romans used mounted couriers. These riders carried messages between the main army and the rear supply depots, riding along the same roads the wagons used. They traveled light and fast, often switching horses at way stations. A message from the front to the nearest granary could arrive in a single day, even if the wagons took a week to cover the same distance. When a general learned that a depot was running low, he could adjust his route, send a detachment to forage, or request emergency supplies from a neighboring province. The Mongol system was faster and more flexible. Their riders, called arrow messengers, were selected for their endurance and loyalty. They carried messages in sealed pouches and never stopped except to change horses at the yam stations. In emergencies, they would ride through the night, guided by the stars and the steppe. A message could travel 200 miles in a single day, a speed that no other ancient system could match. The Mongols also used signal fires on hilltops. A chain of fires could pass a warning across hundreds of miles in a matter of hours. If a supply column was ambushed, the nearest station would light a fire, and the next station would see it and light its own, and so on until the main army knew to send reinforcements. This visual telegraphy was essential when the army was spread across a wide front. The Persians had their own version. Along the Royal Road, they stationed lookouts on towers who used fire signals and smoke to convey simple messages. A single fire might mean a supply convoy was approaching. 2 fires meant danger. The system was crude but effective for immediate threats. More detailed information traveled by mounted courier, using the same relay system of fresh horses at every station. The Persian couriers were famous for their speed, and the Greek historian Herodotus wrote that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stayed them from their appointed rounds. That phrase, later adopted by the United States Postal Service, originally described the relentless dedication of these ancient riders. The speed of information was a weapon in itself. A general who learned about a shortage in time could divert his army to a different route, or send a fast column to seize grain from a local village before the enemy could burn it. A general who learned too late found his soldiers eating their own pack animals. The whole logistical machine depended on this flow of news, and the commanders who mastered it were the ones who could adapt before disaster struck. The silence of a messenger who never arrived was often the first sign of a ruined campaign. The silence of a messenger who never arrived was often the first sign of a ruined campaign, and some of history's greatest disasters began with a single miscalculation in supply. The Athenian Sicilian expedition of 415 before the Common Era stands as a stark lesson in overreach. Athens, at the height of its power, sent a massive fleet of over 100 ships and thousands of soldiers to conquer the island of Syracuse. The plan seemed bold, but the generals misjudged the distance, the local resources, and the enemy's determination. They assumed they could live off the land and that the Sicilian cities would welcome them as liberators. Instead, they found a hostile countryside, few allies, and a Syracuse that had prepared its own grain stores. The Athenian supply line stretched across the open sea, vulnerable to storms and enemy triremes. When a desperate battle in the harbor failed, the Athenians were trapped. Their siege equipment was useless, their food ran out, and they had to retreat inland. The retreat turned into a deadly march through unknown terrain, where local tribes attacked and the soldiers weakened from hunger. Of the original force, only a handful survived to tell the tale. The whole campaign collapsed not because the Athenians were poor fighters, but because they had not calculated how much grain a fleet of 5,000 men would need for a siege that lasted months. A similar blindness struck the Roman general Crassus when he marched into the desert of Mesopotamia in 53 before the Common Era. He had heard stories of Parthian wealth and saw an easy conquest. But he ignored the advice of local guides who warned him about the lack of water and the endless open plains. Crassus led his legions into a treeless, dry landscape where the Roman supply wagons could not keep up and the soldiers could not find forage for their horses. The Parthian archers, mounted on fast horses, surrounded the slow Roman column and rained arrows from a distance. The Romans could not fight back effectively because the enemy stayed out of sword range. Crassus tried to negotiate, but the Parthians captured and killed him. The survivors were either slaughtered or taken into slavery, and the legion's eagle standards, the symbol of Roman power, were lost. The disaster at Carrhae was a failure of logistics before it was a failure of tactics. Crassus had assumed his army could march across the desert as easily as it crossed Gaul, but he had not secured a chain of water depots, nor had he prepared for the long, dry distances between rivers. The margin between a successful campaign and a catastrophe often came down to a few days of rations or a single overlooked well. The lesson echoes across centuries. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812, though far later, follows the same pattern. He assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men, and pushed deep into Russian territory. But the Russians refused to fight a decisive battle. Instead, they retreated, burning their own fields and villages as they went. Napoleon's supply lines stretched over 1,000 miles, and his wagons could not carry enough food for such a massive force. The horses died by the thousands from exhaustion and starvation, and the soldiers began to march on empty stomachs. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he found it abandoned and burning. There was no food, no shelter, and no surrender. He had to retreat, and that retreat became a death march through the Russian winter. Temperatures dropped far below freezing, and the starving, poorly clothed soldiers fell by the roadside. Of the original Grand Army, only a fraction returned. The cause was not a single battle defeat, but a misjudgment of how much food a moving city of men and animals consumes, and how quickly that land can be stripped bare. These disasters share a common thread: a commander who trusted in his own momentum and ignored the quiet arithmetic of supply. The thin margin of error meant that a delay of a week, a drought that dried a river, or a single burned granary could turn a conquering army into a starving mob. The silent lesson from these ruins is that no ambition, no courage, and no strategy can outrun the simple need for bread and water. And when that need goes unmet, history remembers the collapse long after the names of the generals fade. The heavy spoked wheel changed the entire calculation of ancient supply. Before its widespread adoption, most wheels were solid, carved from a single slab of wood. Those wheels cracked under heavy loads, and they were so heavy themselves that they wasted the strength of the animals that pulled them. The spoked wheel, made of a wooden rim connected to a central hub by lightweight spokes, was stronger, lighter, and more flexible. It could roll over rough ground without shattering, and it allowed wagons to carry heavier loads with fewer animals. A Roman supply wagon equipped with spoked wheels could transport the same grain that once required 2 oxen with a single animal instead. That reduction in animal needs meant less fodder to carry, fewer mouths to feed, and a longer reach for every campaign. But the wheel was only part of the story. The horse collar, which appeared in China around the 3rd century before the Common Era, was an even more transformative invention. Before it, horses were harnessed with a yoke that pressed against their windpipe, choking them when they tried to pull heavy loads. A horse in an old yoke could only manage about 1/3 of what an ox could pull. The horse collar redistributed the weight across the horse's chest and shoulders, leaving its throat free to breathe. Suddenly, a horse could pull a wagon as easily as an ox, but far faster. That changed the pace of supply for any army lucky enough to possess this technology. The Romans, though they did not invent the horse collar, adapted it into their own system. They used a heavy harness called the carballo, a type of pack saddle or light cart designed for mules and horses. The carballo allowed a single animal to carry up to 200 pounds of supplies over long distances without the weight touching its neck. This meant that a Roman army could replace slow ox-drawn wagons with faster, more nimble mule trains, cutting travel time between depots in half. The combination of spoked wheels, efficient harnesses, and lighter cart designs meant that a legion could move its daily grain supply with fewer animals and fewer support personnel. Those freed animals and men could be assigned to other tasks like foraging or scouting, making the whole army more flexible. On water, ship designers made similar breakthroughs. The Romans developed the corbita, a merchant vessel that could carry over 200 tons of grain, enough to feed a legion for a month. These ships had deep holds and wide beams, and they relied on a single large square sail. They were slow but steady, and they could make long voyages across the Mediterranean without needing to stop. The Ptolemaic Greeks in Egypt built even larger grain carriers, some reaching over 300 tons, with multiple decks and a crew of just a few dozen sailors. These ships turned the sea into a floating highway, moving supplies from Egypt to Rome or from North Africa to the frontier in days rather than weeks. What made these ships truly innovative was the use of mortise and tenon joints, where wooden planks were locked together with wooden pegs. This created hulls that were watertight and strong enough to survive storms. The result was a reliable transport system that could move the bulk of an army's food by water, leaving the roads free for light troops and messengers. These technological innovations did not just make supply easier, they changed what was possible. A general who knew his grain could move by sea and then by light cart inland could plan campaigns that would have been impossible a century earlier. He could cross a desert, lay siege to a coastal city, and keep his army fed for months, all because the wheels turned more freely, the horses breathed easier, and the ships sailed farther. The quiet inventions of wheels, collars, and hulls were the real engines of ancient conquest, hidden beneath the noise of battle but turning the world in their direction. The technology of wheels and hulls meant nothing without the invisible architecture of paperwork. Every grain shipment, every casualty report, every route change had to be recorded on clay, wax, or wood, or the whole system collapsed into chaos. The armies that conquered continents were not just marching columns, they were sprawling bureaucracies, and at their center stood the military scribe. These were not romantic figures, they were the accountants of the ancient world, men who could read, write, and calculate faster than a soldier could sharpen a sword. A Roman legion on campaign generated a constant stream of records, lists of rations issued to each century, inventories of weapons stored in the depot tallies of pack animals that had died or gone lame, reports on the condition of roads and bridges. All of this information flowed into the office of the quartermaster, a position known in the later empire as the frumentarius. The word itself meant grain man because the most critical task was tracking the supply of wheat. The frumentarius was responsible for knowing exactly how much grain was in every fort, every depot, and every wagon, and for calculating how long it would last given the current number of soldiers and animals. A miscalculation of even a few bushels could mean the difference between a full ration and a hungry march. In the Roman province of Britannia, archaeologists have uncovered a treasure of evidence for this administrative world. At the fort of Vindolanda, near Hadrian's Wall, the damp soil preserved hundreds of thin wooden writing tablets dating from the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. These tablets are not grand declarations of war, they are mundane lists and letters. One tablet lists the daily rations for a unit of cavalry, noting the number of barley rations for the horses and the bread for the men. Another tablet is a request for more grain, written in the neat cursive of a legionary scribe. A third tablet contains a birthday invitation from one officer's wife to another, showing that even a remote frontier fort was tied into the same supply chain that fed the entire empire. The scribes of Vindolanda were not just copying orders, they were the nervous system of the army, transmitting information about shortages, surpluses, and delays. The tablets even record the names of individual soldiers who had fallen ill or been injured, showing that the administration tracked not only food but the fighting strength of the unit. This attention to detail allowed the Roman command to shift resources from one fort to another, to anticipate a shortage before it became a crisis, and to keep the legions fed through the long, dark winters of the north. The tradition of military record-keeping was far older than Rome. In Mesopotamia, over 2,000 years earlier, the scribes of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires used cuneiform writing on clay tablets to track the movement of grain, animals, and weapons. These tablets are small, often no bigger than a hand, but they contain the same kind of information that a Roman quartermaster would recognize. One tablet from the city of Mari records a shipment of barley to a garrison, including the names of the officials who signed for it and the date of delivery. Another tablet lists the number of sheep and goats being sent to feed the army on a campaign. The scribes stamped their seals on the tablets to authenticate them, creating an early form of verification that prevented theft and fraud. These records were stored in archives, sometimes in large rooms lined with shelves, where they could be consulted years later to settle disputes or plan new campaigns. The sheer volume of surviving tablets shows how deeply the administrative habit ran in ancient military culture. The scribes also kept rosters. A unit on the march needed to know exactly how many men were fit for duty, how many were sick, and how many had been lost in skirmishes. These records were used to calculate rations and to request replacements from the central government. Without accurate rosters, a general could not know whether he had enough soldiers to fight a battle or enough food to sustain a siege. The scribes produced daily strength reports, often written on waxed wooden tablets that could be erased and reused, making them efficient and portable. In the field, a commander would carry a small chest of these tablets, updating them each night as the losses and gains of the day were tallied. The scribes were not glamorous. They sat in tents or in the corner of a fort, hunched over their tablets, writing by the light of an oil lamp, but they held the army together. every ration that reached a soldier's hands, every arrow that arrived at a siege line, every horse that was fed, all of it depended on the quiet, steady work of these record keepers. They were the ones who turned the vast, hungry mass of an army into something that could be measured, predicted, and managed. The empire marched on its stomach, yes, but that stomach was fed by the endless columns of figures written by men whose names history has mostly forgotten. And it is in those forgotten tablets, buried in the soil of a British fort or the ruins of a Mesopotamian palace, that we find the true skeleton of ancient logistics. Each of these empires solved the same problem in a completely different way because they faced a different world. The Romans built their supply chain on the foundation of permanent roads and fortified granaries, a state-run system that could feed a legion for months without relying on local farmers. This worked brilliantly across the Mediterranean, where the climate was predictable and the rivers flowed year-round. But when they tried to march into the deserts of Mesopotamia, the same system failed because there were no roads to build and no rivers to carry grain barges. The Roman model was rigid, efficient, and heavy, suited for a world where the enemy stood still long enough to be besieged. The Mongols faced the opposite reality. Their terrain was the endless grass of the steppe, where no road could last and no granary could stand, so they abandoned the idea of fixed depots entirely. Their supply chain was alive, moving on four legs, eating grass and drinking from every stream they crossed. The Mongol army was not fed by a bureaucracy but by the herds that surrounded it. This made them incredibly fast and flexible, but it also meant they could only campaign where the grass grew. A desert or a frozen winter landscape would stop them as surely as a wall. The Persians, positioned between these extremes, built a hybrid system. They used the Royal Road to establish a chain of state runway stations stocked with grain from the provinces, but they also allowed foraging and local purchase to supplement the official supply. Their technology included the Carrhae underground canals that brought water to arid regions, allowing them to sustain armies where the Mongols could not. The Persians adapted to the dry heart of their empire by engineering water into the supply chain itself. The Chinese, meanwhile, faced the challenge of a vast, river-crossed landscape with dense populations. They relied on the Grand Canal and other waterways to move grain, and they built a bureaucracy that tracked every kernel from the field to the frontier. Their system was state-controlled but water-based, less rigid than the Roman road network, and more predictable than Mongol herding. The underlying principle that emerges from these four approaches is simple. The best supply chain is the one that matches the environment. A system that works on the grassy plains of Mongolia will collapse in the rocky mountains of Anatolia. A bureaucracy that can count every grain in the Yangtze Valley will be useless if it cannot build a boat. The Romans, Mongols, Persians, and Chinese all succeeded because they tailored their logistics to the land they lived in, not the land they wished they had. The lesson for any organization, whether an empire or a modern business, is that the most efficient system is not the most advanced technology, but the one that fits the terrain, the season, and the people who have to operate it. And the armies that forgot this principle, like Crassus in the desert or Napoleon in the snow, learned it in the hardest way possible. The secret to marching across a continent was never about carrying more. It was about understanding what the land could give and knowing exactly when to take it. The armies of antiquity did not conquer continents with courage alone. They conquered them with grain, water, grass, and roads, all moved by a quiet machine of planning that most people never see. The enduring lesson is that no ambition, no strategy, and no weapon can outrun the simple math of food and distance. Every general who marched too far without a depot, who ignored the seasons, who assumed the land would provide, learned this truth in the hardest way possible. The ones who succeeded built systems, not just armies. They created networks of depots, roads, canals, and relay stations that turned a sprawling, hungry mass into something that could be measured, predicted, and sustained. Adaptability was just as critical. The best commanders did not cling to a single model. They read the terrain, adjusted their supply chains to match the climate, and knew when to shift from heavy wagons to light packs, from state granaries to local foraging. The infrastructure they left behind, roads that still exist, canals that still carry water, granaries that still stand, is a testament to the idea that logistics is not a boring footnote but the very foundation of civilization itself. When you look at a modern supply chain, whether for a grocery store, an online shipment, or a disaster relief effort, you are seeing the same principles at work. The same need for prediction, for redundancy, for understanding the limits of distance and time. The ancient armies that mastered these principles reshaped the world. And the ones that ignored them vanished into the dust of forgotten campaigns. So the next time you see a convoy of trucks or a cargo ship on the horizon, remember the Roman mule train, the Mongol herd, the Persian way station, and the Chinese canal barge. All of them were part of the same story, a story about how humans learned to move not just themselves but everything they needed to survive. If this hidden history of logistics surprised you, hit the like button and subscribe. There is a whole world of secrets buried beneath the stories of battles and kings, and they are waiting to be uncovered.